I think there's sometimes when something like a warm croissant can, while it's still warm, it has something about it that is more exalted and draws our attention more than when it cools down. I want to go into the question of free will, which now I analogize with that. Still warm yellow and orange crisp croissant for the reason that we have uh, the issues that Zizek has been allowed to write articles lately for the RT network, or the Russian state network, whereas he's not been allowed to write for um, many publications in the West for the reason that he is never completely on board with, let's say, the progressive Western liberalism. He always has his unintuitive critiques and his sort of saving clauses, which show that he's not completely with the program. And you if you're in the news media business, if somebody says anything that's not totally on your program, then you lose some readership for when you do that. Um, that's the strongest superficial uh, um, uh, way things are happening. I think with the media, of course, there's levels, strata of understanding what's happening with this sort of absolute hegemonic takeover that we're witnessing in some sense. But in any case, these lipid experiments, these have been around for, I think this is more than 50 years old. But there's much more. This is what Gigi gives reference to, the lipid experiments. I've studied them I don't know, some time ago in the past. They, they're not the most interesting thing to study because they're so vague as to the interpretation. And later on, there's some Germans right now that have done it in these kind of experiments. The basic idea is that you um, have someone make some kind of choice, and then you're looking at their brain through an MRI or whatever it is, and you know in advance, or claim to know in advance, what they're going to say before they themselves consciously come to aware of what choice they're going to make and verbalize it, which is all ambiguous in itself. But what's even worse, I think, is that it's statistical, and they're often wrong. So you have that minority report issue that, remember the Philip K. Dick book, and the Steven Spielberg film about the minority report. There's perfect prediction of crimes, only as it turns out, sometimes they're wrong. So these remind the problems which is already well known to Kant when he was thinking of how morality can get in with Newtonian calculus controlling the understanding of the physical world. But I think what makes it interesting is where we have this idea that Zizek puts forward most clearly of the pundits that are and thinkers that are interpreting these things, which I would say usually one would say, yeah, it's true what Aristotle said, that we have the sense of being the hegemon or the despot with respect to our own body. We kind of have that sense, more or less, but that we can move our limbs or so. But then, very early on, already in Plato, already before Aristotle even said that, there comes this question which comes down at least to Thomas in the 13th century about the way what we know decides what we're going to do. So I think that's it's called something in Thomas is something like the, arbitrium voluntas or something along those lines. But in any case, it's something to do with the ego arbiter, with our internal judgment, as it were, our ability to think this is the right course of action, this is not the right course of action, but it's never um, uh, connected to this idea of something like I don't know how it would be like the bitrium voluntas or something, the liberal or the free will. It's never a question of free will. It's a question of will as modified by the by arbitration, by our own internal arbitration or discernment, which is based on our knowledge. So then it's obvious that there's this problem that we're never if we were acting wisely, if we're acting according to true knowledge, that would be that would deserve to be called somehow free will. That comes then if once you get to Kant, that becomes explicit because he's talking about um, autonomy as something different than just freedom from. Autonomy is the genuine freedom, and that means being moved by not by anything external, but only through the human essence itself, which would be general, which would also be identified with wisdom in some sense, because it would be having discerned the human essence through the mechanism of the categorical imperative, which is the crutch, which in a way Kant's ship flounders on, at least, if not, or maybe if not actually going under on. But there's several problems in Kant. But I think Zizek gives a nice as it were, example of what I was trying to get at with the heated croissant, with the notion of the. He gives the example of Khrushchev banging his hand on the table and saying, "Your grandchildren will speak Russian; they'll be communists." And then in Khrushchev's period, this still seemed like a possibility. So it was kind of, people were shaken by that. But by the time, who was the next guy, the Beriev or something? By the time the next guy got in after Khrushchev, this was no longer seemed to be a serious possibility that the Soviet Union would win out against the West. So, but in the way this, I think what's added recently with the Elon Musk stuff is this idea that it's not just that, okay, it's fine, we identify ourselves with our neurons. Neurons are physical things. You can push around physical things. But this idea that we would experience, this idea that Zizek hones in on, that we would, and is apparently, I don't know if he's genuinely all that anxious about it. He seems sometimes to be extremely anxious about it, but I don't know. But maybe he just thinks it's interesting, and it also conforms to his sort of post-Soviet atheism, which I think is quite distinct from Dawkins' type of atheism, and I detect it in others of the same background. But this idea that we would experience ourselves as still being the hegemon of our own bodies, even if our neurons are being pushed around and controlled by remote control. And that seems actually right now, as in some way possible, makes it still the croissant that hasn't lost all its heat and hasn't just become a mere plaything for the intellect to poke about. And my purpose in approaching this is, one, to touch on a Heideggerian issue, and two, to sift about in this confusing issue over what free will is even supposed to mean. So I point out one thing is, with regard to the problem of free will, is it seems to have two basic and distinct modes that we understand it in, using the word mode indifferently. One is the moral issue. So if you tell people that they don't have free will, they tend to cheat and do corrupt things. So this is sometimes people say that has to do with Calvinism. I'm not sure if that's actually really true, because what happened with Calvin apparently is that he went to, we're talking the 16th century here. So he went to Geneva. He managed to get himself a cushy position in Geneva, basically in charge of of the Genevan Republic. And then there were a lot of elites that were into speculation and the things that later came to fruition, probably in the Dutch Golden Age, if you think of the tulip craze and all that. But what he told them is that he altered a clause, as it were, in his theology, and allowed for usury. So if you take that as the main issue, the corruption of Calvin in that main sense, then maybe his doctrine on, with all the things that have in his theology that have to do with free will, might not have been the main thing. It's clearer with Kant, because of the whole issue where Kant thinks that choosing freely is everything. So if there is no choosing freely, if everything's about the historical, how do they call it, the historical disadvantages, and or your parents did something to you and that's why you've become a monster or whatever it would. If you can always point to something else, then you're excused, right? So there's this one sense where free will is a question of moral excuse or moral or culpability. But then there's a whole nother sense, which I think is linked to these Libet issues and to the pushing around and to causality in the sense of the experimental sciences, where free will is a question of is a question which I think we get our orientation from what we were just going over, from this issue of we would still have this. So this is where it connects sort of to Heidegger and Husserl, is we have this phenomenological sense in some way of freedom, but it's the reason why I think that none of us really have the sense of free will is because immediately this issue of what I just mentioned of whether we're fully informed comes in, and also most of if we're talking about moving our finger freely, Chomsky likes to give the example of, oh, we all have the sense of free will. We all know that I can choose to move my little finger. This is very trivial. Then how far does the free will actually go? Obviously, we can't just do anything we want. I remember Freud used to give these examples when. It's been a long time since I read Freud, but Freud gives somewhere the example of a man would want to compliment the beauty of every splendid female he came across, but he's unable to do it. He feels restrained. Society might be restraining him, and so on. But this would extend to everything in life. You think of the Jordan Peterson examples of, we want to set ourselves to some program of study, and we have it all denoted, but do we actually carry it out? Free will seems a very meager thing if it's just limited to sort of a thought that we can move or make a fist if we want or whatnot. Maybe we can't even do that. There's sort of we can doubt that too, because it's also like most of the time, as Heidegger would say, we're just sort of doing things, and we're not deliberating over whether we want to come to a decision. That's a big issue in Derrida. I think he talks about whether actually even when we speak of making a decision that even makes any sense. There's a lot of problems like that when you look in this way that it's usually said that, it's obvious that we have, through our own experience, this obvious sense that we have free will, but then it can be contradicted through experiments and through the notion of the causal empirical idea of determinacy of action, which comes to all sorts of crazy problems like the free will of atoms and who's his name? I think his name is John Conway, I believe. There's a guy that has the doctrine of the notion of that we don't have free will, but the atoms have free will, because when we speak subjectively, he's a mathematician who did some work with a physicist. When we as a physicist make some prediction, and then we have the idea of the stochastics, or the maths of approximation, or statistics or whatnot, there could be God on the other side, as it were, calling out the numbers and deciding what all the things that appear to us to be only a matter of probabilities, which can't be exactly predicted, but they could be exact from the sense of the objective side of it, the side that we can't reach as human beings. Or they could be, the atoms could have, as it were, some kind of genuine free will. But you see, you get all kinds of problems like that. But I think it's particularly interesting, this sense that Heidegger draws this difficulty, which is that the illusion is something that's in being. So say we do have these sort of Aristotelian sense of being the hegemon of our own body, right? But then we also find out that these things Zizek are dangling before us, this threat, the impending threat of that we would still experience ourselves like that, even though we were being controlled by somebody with a computer somewhere. How, by analogy, say something like thinking that seeing the sun as floating across the sky, right? Even though we know that the Earth is turning, or these other issues, like there could be these notions that people had all kinds of ideas that were false in general in the past, that were illusions, and then they were shown to be false. But Heidegger is suggesting that can you really say that someone's whole life, the life of many generations of whole civilizations, were simply false? The phenomena that they lived in were simply false. So I think that question, this confrontation between these two regions of understanding, come into the whole thinking of the history of being. And all these questions in some way touch upon how we should understand Dasein. So I invite anybody that has something to contribute to this to write in. Admittedly, our reflections here are still somewhat confused, and we try to think through them more as we go along. And so we'll probably go back to the Grundbegriffe some more, even though we're only making very slow progress in it.